Is there any commonly used phrase in our discourse today that has less concrete meaning than social justice? Let's explore.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit.
Welcome to the occupation. Hang your collar up inside. Hang your freedom higher.
It's the only way to be sure.
The practice of tacking the word social in front of the word justice and acting like you've just said something comprehensible has been around since at least the early years of the Industrial Revolution. The phrase didn't really take off until around the end of the Reagan era. Shortly before social justice was suddenly everywhere, it was a pretty niche term. For a few years, the phrase political correctness had a lot of currency, but it was so easily lampooned that it was soon allowed to fade into well-deserved obscurity. One still hears it, obviously, but it is nowhere near as ubiquitous as it once was. And then, as if out of nowhere, all the same people who were always on about political correctness were parroting the phrase social justice instead. A phrase that had been bandied about on the fringe left for over a century, occasionally popping up in broader discussion and fading away again, finally achieved escape velocity and entered the vernacular. And as is so often the case with such amorphous phraseology, all the people pushing to make it so acted like they were saying something meaningful, but were actually saying pretty much nothing. Over about 20 years, the phrase gradually wormed its way into almost every corner of our discourse. Unlike the excesses of the political correctness movement, its imprecision made social justice hard to pin down and thus kind of hard to satirize. It certainly sounds good to the kind of people who use it, and it can basically mean anything they want it to, so it's easy for all of them to say they want it precisely because of its ambiguousness. So an entire generation was educated by people portentously using this phrase as if they were truly advocating something deep. And then they, in turn, started getting jobs in education and started teaching millennials. Then we got Obama, the perfect blank slate upon which the equally contentless idea of social justice could project its dreams of immanentizing the eschaton. Intersectionality became a thing. Millennials started graduating from college and getting jobs that gave them various bits of the cultural high ground. And thus, the social justice warrior was born. And then finally, social justice had taken a form that could be made fun of. The same scattershot big tent for whatever so-called progressive claptrap lack of clarity that had largely protected the phrase from being poked fun at for so long now opened it up to lampooning. Because, as everyone who isn't an SJW knows, SJWs are utterly ridiculous. It's a never-ending dog chasing its tail race for intersectional woke points and clawing for rank in the progressive stack. Except, of course, for the absurd beta males with ironic facial hair and hats that make them look like boys trying to be their fathers but having no idea what it was that made their fathers men. Those ones, the ones who happily flagellate themselves for their original sin of having been born white males, are hilarious in their own special way. So now we could make fun of social justice, and a bunch of new academic jargon had been layered on top of it, but we still couldn't say what it actually means. Wikipedia defines social justice as, quote, a concept of fair and just relations between the individual and society, end quote, which is meaningless. Almost every ideology mankind has ever devised is, in some way, a concept of fair and just relations between the individual and society.
I mean, say what you want about the tenets of National Socialism, dude. At least it's an ethos.
Which serves to underscore how slippery words like fair and just are. In an apparent attempt to make this empty pabulum appear to have some weight, Wikipedia goes on to say that social justice is, quote, measured by the explicit and tacit terms for distribution of wealth, opportunities for personal activity, and social privileges, end quote. This really isn't much help. Perhaps the closest that page comes to clarity is the second paragraph, which reads, quote, social justice assigns rights and duties in the institutions of society, which enables people to receive the basic benefits and burdens of cooperation, end quote. That's a really long-winded way of saying from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, which is at least a hint of what social justice actually is, a way to talk about fairness and equality without having to use the word socialism. So we're starting to work our way toward an actual practical definition of social justice, but we still have a few more steps to go. In the early 20th century, progressive was a fairly ill-defined reformist banner generally advocating that government needed to do more than merely secure the blessings of liberty and actively undertake to fix societal problems. Everyone from Teddy Roosevelt to Woodrow Wilson to eugenicist Margaret Sanger adopted it as a label. In the post-Stalin portion of the 20th century, progressive was a code word for communist. Then at the end of the century, the word liberal became a dirty word, so progressives started calling themselves progressives instead. Obviously, the appeal of the word all along is that it is implicit in the term that their ideas represent progress, which is weird since they are wholly and completely regressive. But lefties have a very Humpty Dumpty-like attitude towards words, especially words that the general population likes and understands. Words like equality, which in Western liberal democracies that operate under the rule of law means the absence of legal impediments to opportunity. But to a leftist, it means that all outcomes are the same. A lefty can never accept the notion that it's fair for one person to have more stuff than another person, no matter the respective traits, abilities, effort expended by, or other differences between them. They pray before the altar of diversity, but actually loathe the idea that people are all actually different. The word fair does have a meaning. Merriam-Webster defines it as marked by impartiality and honesty, free from self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism, which is a pretty good definition. But that's not really what we mean in our day-to-day use of the word. The vernacular use of the word fair is difficult to define objectively. The best we imperfect humans can do to provide fairness in society is to ensure that the law doesn't privilege anyone over anyone else by fiat. But when we talk about fairness, we're usually talking about our subjective feelings, which is the standard mode in which SJWs operate. They don't want mere impartiality because that inevitably leads to an unequal distribution of resources. And since the hallmark of a leftist is the obviously false but nevertheless necessary worldview that everything is a zero-sum game, unequal distribution of resources can only mean that someone got some of theirs at the expense of someone else. The smarter ones among them realize, at least at some level, that Western liberal democracies have actually enacted equality before the law. It's not perfect in application, but there's not much tweaking left to be done to get the black-letter law as close to the ideal as can be achieved. This is why we hear so much about quote-unquote privilege that arises from things that have nothing to do with the supposedly privileged person. Your biological sex, skin color, sexuality, and so on confer privilege or marginalization upon you in various degrees. Rank poorly on the progressive stack and get sent to the back of the line to pay for the sins of your patriarchal fathers. Your own accomplishments, contributions, and ideas are irrelevant. You can never do enough to erase the stain of having been born white, male, or heterosexual. But even this is merely a stepping stone. It's the current stage of the long march through the culture that Marxist Antonio Gramsci recommended to progressives from his jail cell. The end of the road is, of course, the communist utopia. Gramsci believed that the culture imposed its own norms on the populace, and thus informed common sense. In order to actually succeed in bringing about communism, it was first necessary to take over the culture and impose new social norms. He proposed that leftists undertake what he called the long march through the culture in order to do so. Looking at the state of the media, academia, and entertainment today, can there be any doubt that his intellectual successors heeded the call and succeeded? The level of hegemony SJWs have achieved over Western culture in just a couple of generations must be beyond his wildest dreams. It's also pretty obvious that they know it and are making every effort to press their advantage while they have it. But they're still up against the same problems all utopians have. People are inherently conservative. Not in the political sense necessarily, but even a dyed-in-the-wool liberal doesn't like rapid change when it affects his personal interests. People prefer stability, a thing that was rare in our evolutionary history, but which Western liberal democracy is actually pretty good at providing. So resistance to the progressive project continues. They have more work to do, but they're still getting pretty obvious about what they're trying to do. The boomer cohort of the Long March that really got it going is starting to die off and want to see some results. The millennials, typically of young people, don't see why they should have to wait when they obviously know best. And they all agree that everyone who opposes them is a bad person. 25 years or so ago, I figured out what social justice actually means. Nothing that's happened since has altered that understanding. Social justice is the notion that a perfectly fair and just society can be achieved if only enough people wish it so. The fatal flaw of this idea is that it's kind of true. From writing pamphlets to protesting to mounting revolutions, major social changes, for good or ill, don't happen until the conservative majority that just wants to get along under the status quo is pressed hard enough that a tipping point is reached and change accepted. But for a change to endure, it has to be an actual improvement. Slavery took millennia to go from being an ordinary and acceptable social institution to the anathema it is now understood by almost everyone to be. Eliminating the appurtenances of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, racism, took a century to codify into law, and we're still doing the cleanup at the fringes of society. But, apart from those fringes, a society that once considered those things perfectly normal now understands that they are irredeemably wrong. In the United States, it took a horrifying civil war, decades of force, and a couple of lifetimes, but eventually enough people wished it so, and it was in fact achieved. At the time of this recording, Venezuela appears to be very close to a tipping point away from socialism and back towards sanity, but it hasn't happened yet and could still be smothered in the crib. Despite socialism's perfect record of such failure, Gramsci's followers are, of course, convinced that whatever flavor of socialism they happen to prefer is totally just and right. They're wrong. Socialism always and inevitably leads to misery, death, and starvation for the masses, and wealth and privilege for the few at the top. But they still believe it. So they just need to convince enough others to wish it so in order to make it happen. If you wonder why they spew so much venom at people who disagree with them, this is it. Apart perhaps from a few cynical ones who simply expect to be among the privileged leadership if they ever get their way, SJWs and their fellow travelers actually believe that they have found the path to fairness, justice, and equality. If you are one of the rational people, the ones who've studied enough history to know what will actually happen, and therefore oppose them, their worldview forces them to view you in a very specific way. Since you disagree with their program of change, you must necessarily prefer the status quo. They aren't interested in hearing about history. They don't want to hear about how capitalism has been the greatest engine of prosperity and happiness for the overwhelming majority of the human race the species has ever devised. They know capitalism is bad because it is the system that produced all the unfairness, injustice, and inequality they perceive and want to overcome. So if you don't want to join them, if you want to maintain this engine of actual provable progress, then you must want all the unfairness, injustice, and inequality, and that makes you evil. That is what social justice means.